I'm done. I'm free. There we go. Hi, I'm Bob the Booker, and welcome to my channel. And yes, I have the kind of freedom of this is that I have finished reading the book A Longlist, and I don't mean to make this sound like a curse that I've managed to survive. It was a fun experience. I'm really glad I read them. But it's more. I think I sort of find there's an odd pressure for me to kind of read them as quickly as I can because I also, as well as the kind of the sort of general push of kind of the kind of the marching of time and wanting to read other things, there's also an element where I don't want to be influenced too much by hearing other people's thoughts about the book. So for me, I kind of like to quite have to kind of have the focus of reading it and then only sort of really watching reviews of books after I finish them. I try to kind of almost keep as spoiler-free a thing for myself as I can on that. Not necessarily successfully, but I try. And yeah, so here we are. I've reached the end of the 13 books, and I think actually it's been a bit of an interesting roller coaster for me. Essentially, when the long list was announced, I'd read almost 5. I was just finishing the safekeep of the books. And so and from the 5 I'd read, I had quite a few books in there that were real sort of favourites for me. You know, James by Percival Everett, My Friends by Hisham Attar. I had read Held and had mixed feelings. Well, I'd enjoyed the reading experience, but couldn't remember a single thing about it. I'd read something else, which I now can't remember, and was mostly enjoying The Safekeep as well. But then I hit a bit of a lull for a little bit afterwards. I started reading Headshot, which I loved, and then sort of had a few books in a row that I just really couldn't find my way into properly, or I enjoyed but didn't feel they were massively strong. So for example, books like Creation Lake that I felt a little bit let down by in its ending. A book like Wild Houses that I enjoyed but kind of wanted a little bit more from. And yeah, and then sort of this strange eventful history that I was just a bit lukewarm on. And then I hit a bit of a stride with the final 3 books, being Playground by Richard Powers, and then these 2 lovely books here, Stoneyard Devotional and Enlightenment. And then in between as well, Wandering Stars, which I enjoyed a fair bit. So it's a bit of an odd mix of books in some ways for me. And this is always the case with the long list, which I have to remind myself. I think always going into it, there's a perception that, you know, these are the 13 best books. And, you know, that's to some degree how prizes build themselves, right? You are only picking the best books within certain criteria and categories, right? And of the submissions that you've received. And I think my initial belief or feeling around some of that was perhaps coloured by the fact that a book like Praiseworthy, which I will not stop talking about, one of my favourite books of the year, wasn't on the list. And so sometimes that's the frustration where the more you read of the long list, you read other books where you're like, this could have been Praiseworthy. Praiseworthy could have been here instead of this book. But then the thing you have to sort of, I suppose, remind yourself of is this is 5 people, not locked in a room, but metaphorically locked in a room, who are really ready to kind of just read this 140, 150 books, come to the decision, a kind of consensus decision, importantly, on those books. And so something like Praiseworthy, for example, could well have been a book that a couple of judges loved and a couple of others hated, and by that metric might not have made it, for example. And so I have to remind myself that, even though Praiseworthy, I think, should be there. But anyway, I'm not bitter. But now that I've read the long list in totality, there's something quite interesting, I think, about trying to piece together some of the themes of the list. And actually, particularly in my last few reads, this has come together in quite a few ways. So I'm going to try to loosely put that together here, but and then I'm going to offer my own my ideal shortlist from this as well. So let's get going. So first up, a theme that I've noticed kind of coming up, particularly in the last few books that I've read, is this kind of idea of forgiveness, and or kind of who gets to do that, this sense of guilt. And again, without spoiling anything here, there are a couple of books like My Friends by Hisham Attar, Stoneyard Devotional by Charlotte Wood, To some degree as well, Enlightenment by Sarah Perry, and a couple of other books really that deal with this idea, Playground as well by Richard Powers, that deal with this idea of how you can go about forgiving someone and if that's ever possible. And particularly as part of that, the lengths that people might go to get this kind of closure. And I don't want to spoil anything with those books in particular, but there's something so beautiful about the way that these books, I think in particular, talk about forgiveness and who gets to decide this. This was a sort of big theme, and again, obviously, the talking about themes with the book A Long List isn't always. It sometimes is a fool's errand. These are 13 books written separately, and it just sort of so happens that sometimes the judges coalesce on. Coalesce is not the right word. Kind of come together on something like this, and so I think here is where I think these books are kind of particularly interesting, where these moments do happen. And here, I think this is quite, there's something kind of really powerful, I think, in the way that these books address them very differently. Something like Stoneyard Devotional has this sort of sense of a very religious overtone around forgiveness. Playground by Richard Powers engages with that idea in a more sort of environmental capacity, around kind of what kind of things are bigger than you. And I'll talk about that in another point as well. But, who gets to make certain kinds of apology, who gets to receive them, and all of those sorts of things. I think in Enlightenment, that is taken to this other degree of there are these big unresolved issues at the end of the book, where characters have to sort of come together and make amends because something is much bigger than them. And I think there's something really interesting in the way that these books do this. And a linked theme to those, I think, and actually almost featuring some of the same books, is a sense of wonder in the natural world. So Playground by Richard Powers, it's particularly about the natural world in terms of the seas and the kind of underwater element of it. But, also kind of the ecosystems that hold together nature. And to some degree, apologies and guilt is kind of linked in with that, because society is itself an ecosystem, and if one of those things is going down because somebody is causing harm, then this has an effect on everything else. The natural world, obviously, as the cover suggests, in Sarah Perry's Enlightenment, also talks really in depth, I think, about this. We are following a comet. We're kind of really intrigued in this book. The characters are really intrigued by the kind of trying to make sense of something that's so out of our ken. It's something, we're trying to put numbers and predictions on comets and naming them and sort of saying who saw it first and who named it first and who sort of designated it first. But this is an unknowable thing. And there's a really beautiful passage in the book where they talk about the kind of unknowingness that you have to have around something like a comet. You just have to sit and experience it. You can't summon it. You can't make it happen. It just happens. And you have to just be there to receive it when it does happen. Equally, Orbital by Samantha Harvey, I think, does this in really beautiful ways. This idea of being above the earth, looking down, and sort of seeing that the sort of petty squabbles of the world are fairly meaningless, because the kind of little things that people are doing in space is so much more important, or so much more full of wonder. This kind of sense of teamwork is happening up in space with people from different nations, but down below, those same people might be, their governments might be at war. And so there's something there about this kind of idea of the natural world and the kind of wonder of space versus this kind of grim reality of sort of what can be grim in politics and kind of interpersonal relationships as well. And I think those sort of books pull really cleverly on some of those things as well. There's also something, I think, in these books about this idea of history and how history remembers things. And although that's a fairly, it happens a lot in fiction and in literature, that's kind of, a big part of it. I think there's something quite special about the way that some of these books approach things around history. So we've got James by Percival Everett, that is a retelling of a story, but kind of with updates of kind of, I think Percival Everett has spoken about this being the book that you know, the original author couldn't write to some degree. That there's something about the kind of being able to look back at this from a different time frame and period of time in history that allows something different to be going on here. And I think there's something so special about the way that that book really engages with history and kind of treats the original novel as almost you know, Huckleberry Finn is like this historical document almost that is then being played with. It's almost an historical event itself with some sirens. Historical event itself that is then being adapted and morphed and various other things. In My Friends by Hisham Mittal, we have real historical events that are being where we sort of see the human effects of people living in and around them. This idea of Syrian, Libyanness, and how it's sort of not something that can be escaped even when you leave Libya. In the same way that I think Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange does really cleverly, where there are, you know, we see at the beginning of this book the history of a family, and we see afterwards a kind of what that family looks like many years down the line. And to some degree, there's a kind of, unlike in James by Percival Everett, history can be something where we reframe it and we look at it in a different way. To some degree, in Wandering Stars, there's a fixity of that history. It's almost not necessarily a curse, but there's a through line to the modern day, and so decisions from the past still very much show up in the current day. And books like Held, I think, also play with some of these ideas of what it means to sort of think about how you live on, how ideas keep on kind of continuing and exist. This Strange Eventful History takes a family history and plays with it. It takes real life events around Algeria and kind of colonization with France, by France, to play with this idea of kind of what is a real history, what is a real story. And I think there's something so engaging in that. Equally in the way that Sarah Perry's Enlightenment takes the kind of the history of trying to understand the origin of the naming of a comet, and it spins it out into something else about a kind of who gets to be in history, who gets to have their name attached to these things, who gets to exist within that. And I think there's something so well done in that. And I'm sure as I'm going, I'm missing various books. Wild Houses is another one where I think something about the kind of idea of a family history has a sort of through line of what, you know, the kind of, again, decisions that are made having a longer term impact, but all of this is over a very tight time frame. And so the idea is that, you know, you grow up in a certain family. Does that dictate what's going to happen next for these characters? Are they trapped in this sort of environment, in this kind of milieu to some degree forever? And so I think so many of the books on the list play with such interesting ideas. And many of these are, you know, kind of core ideas of literature. This is not like a, you know, this is not something that we don't see anywhere else. But I think some of these books do something really clever with it. An example also being Headshot, which I forgot to mention earlier, by Rita Bullwinkle. I think that book does something really clever in terms of this very tight point of view of the characters, and then spinning out into what these women's lives will look like 40, 50, 60 years on. And there's something terrifying about the way the book does that at times, because we just move in one sentence to them at 80, and we see the long-term effects of a really physical task, like, you know, a physical sport like boxing, and how that then plays out into their health as a 70-year-old. And that's a wild thought. One I can't believe I forgot to mention when I'm talking about history, The Safekeep, which very much engages with the kind of the tendrils of history sort of permeating through various bits of people's lives. There's this sort of this strong feeling that, particularly the way that, without spoiling anything, the way this book wraps up shows that there are these little moments of war, and how the World War II, for example, still is showing up in characters' lives many years down the line. These things are to some degree inescapable, or if not inescapable, they very much shape the lives that we exist within. They might have a small impact on the person who raises us, and that might then impact something. And there are just these little tendrils that go throughout these books that I think is so interesting. And in many ways, books like Playground then also toy with the idea of future within that. What does our current timeline suggest a history could be? The future could be, and how will we look back on our current day in terms of that sense of history? And I think some of these books play with this in such interesting ways. I think collectively there's something that makes sense about all of those books, even if I don't always think they kind of come to pass. Creation Lake is one I'm hinting at to some degree with that, where it very much engages with the idea of history in terms of Neanderthals, but I would argue doesn't have as much of a bearing on the book as it at first appears. I don't want to spoil anything, but that's kind of, but I mean, at least was very interesting, those parts about Neanderthal history and this idea of, how people came to be, the kind of things that they prized and saw as important at that time. So yeah, all of these things kind of come together to make this sort of wild ride of a long list. And with that in mind, I'm gonna try to piece together my preferred shortlist. I will kind of, again, sort of state this is the shortlist I want. I'm not necessarily predicting this will be the case. I'll have a stab at predictions. I am notoriously awful at this. I am almost always wrong, but let's give this a go anyway. So my preferred shortlist, and some of these books have been really hit and miss for people. Some of them have been books that I think are kind of a little bit more regularly loved, but let's go through them. So the kind of, I say obvious, none of these are obvious, right? None of them necessarily are more likely to be on than another, but this is one that I feel has, personally, I think has a strong chance because I think it's just a very good book. James by Percival Everett. I think this book is really sharp. It's a very clever use of taking a source material in terms of a novel and re-engaging from a different lens, and with a different lens, the kind of the politics of that novel. So actually looking at a character like Jim in the original book in Huckleberry Finn and imagining him with more of a voice, essentially, and with more character to him, and also that he might be a character who's smarter than the lot of them. And I think this is why this book would be a really smart addition to the shortlist. I think it's just a very, very good book. Next, I would have to say My Friends by Hisham Attar. For similar sort of reasons, I think it's a very sharp book that uses a sort of this underlying story about friendship set against this backdrop of politics and kind of particularly geopolitics, and how the capital P politics affects the kind of day-to-day lives of people who live with that in whichever way, right? The kind of idea that you can be your sort of Libyan identity will follow you, and something can happen in Libya and that affects you even though you had nothing to do with that itself. And I think the book is very sharp for that reason. I would also say Headshot by Rita Bullwinkle. I think this is brilliant. I think this is a really sharp, feisty book. The really intense point of view, I think, really serves this book excellently. I think it's a really compelling story written in a very innovative way, but also with a lot more heft to it than it might at first suggest. I think there's a lot more going on underneath the surface of this book. I would also put in Stoneyard Devotional by Charlotte Wood. I loved this. I thought this was so clever. And there's something about the kind of slightly haunting subtlety to this book that I found completely captivating. That there's something in this book about absolution and penance that feels so heavy, but is also sort of carried quite lightly in the book in very clever ways, I think. So I think this is a really exceptional piece of writing. Which leaves two more spaces. Playground by Richard Powers, which I think is phenomenal. I've gushed about it in a separate video. I loved this. I think it's a book that combines a lot of optimism about the world with with a real kind of cleverness about how it approaches some of its subjects. And I just think this is a really gorgeous book. It made me weep at the end of the book. Not many books do that. So yeah, kind of goes on the list partly for that reason as well. Which leaves just the one final space, and that would for me be Orbital by Samantha Harvey. I think it's an incredibly quiet book, an incredibly sort of subtle book again, but I think there's something about the ways that this book subtly moves things in the background while you're focusing on something else, or does so much with just a short list or with whatever else that I think is so compelling. And I just really enjoyed what this book does. And I think every time I think more about this book, I enjoy it more. Um, and it's something that's worth considering because all of the books from the long list will be reread by the judges to decide the shortlist. And some books I think stack up better on rereads than others. Just some books naturally, the way they're written has that. I think Orbital might, that's one that I'm a bit unsure about whether it will make it or not because of that reason. Because I think there's something about the kind of haunting stillness that really would merit a reread. But I also think that sometimes maybe some of these other books will sort of shout louder on a reread. So I don't know. But those are my six, with potential runner-ups being of books where I really enjoyed them. But they're not, they're just edged out by others. I think probably would be, actually these two here, probably would be either Wandering Stars or Enlightenment. I enjoyed the reading experience of both of them. I think they both have important things to say. I'd probably have Enlightenment just slightly edge that book out, Wandering Stars out, just because I think there's something really hypnotizing about this book that's very subtle and beautiful. And at times I found Wandering Stars a little bit didactic, but both intriguing reads nonetheless. And again, not to say that the other books are bad. They're just books that didn't appeal to me in quite the same way. But we shall see. It's up, it's handed over to the Booker judges now, so we will find out very soon what books have been shortlisted. I'm planning on carrying on my little project that I've been doing for the last couple of years, which has been reading another book by the shortlisted authors. So I'm intrigued if you do have any recommendations, particularly when the shortlist is announced, of other good books by those authors. I'd really love to hear it. I'm planning on reading Orfeo, don't know how you pronounce it, by Richard Powers, but I'd love to hear sort of other books by these authors that you think are worth reading as well. Anyway, take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.